Well, one of the biggest stories today saw Scott Morrison revealing that Australia is under mass cyber attack from a foreign state targeting all levels of government, industry and critical infrastructure operators. And China is believed to be the likely source. I'm joined now by someone well-versed on the security and intelligence threats we face, the head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings, tonight coming to us from Canberra. Peter, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chris. My pleasure.
Are you convinced that this is the work of China?
Absolutely. There's a couple of countries that have the capacity to do this. Russia and North Korea come to mind, but they don't really have the scale and they don't really have the motive. Those three things only come together with China. And of course, China has form. It's been doing this to Australia for years, going back to the hack on Parliament in 2011, the hack on the Bureau of Meteorology in 2016, on the ANU in 2018. They have form, and they're by far the largest cyber aggressor against Australia today.
Yeah, and you came out early today to point the finger at China, and I noticed only a short time ago a Chinese Foreign Affairs spokesman has lashed out at your organisation, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, for claiming China was behind the attack. They are claiming the body has ties to the United States. Have a look at this.
As we pointed out many times, this institute has long been receiving funding from the US government and arms dealers. It has been hyping up or creating all kinds of anti-China topics. It has no reputation at all. And the attacks and the blames coming from this institute against China is totally baseless and nonsense.
Funding from arms dealers, that's interesting. What do you make of that?
Well, these are the arms dealers which supply equipment to the Australian Defence Force, Chris. And unless you want our Defence Force to be disarmed, you need to support Australian defence industry, and Australian defence industry supports us. I might say we also get funding from the government of the Netherlands as well. It's pretty typical for think tanks to do that sort of thing. Frankly, what we're getting from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I believe, constitutes direct interference in Australian domestic politics, and they should leave the commentary to people like us rather than to sort of, traduce the reputation of my institute. We produce careful, fact-based research. And it's such effective research that I find the Chinese refutation of it becoming rather ridiculous and just a little obsessive.
Obsessive, and probably is a badge of honour coming from the Chinese regime at the moment. I keep hearing today that our personal...
Bit of a KPI, Chris.
Yes, correct. I keep hearing today that our personal details have not been breached, but if they had, would they tell us? And I noticed today that The Age, late this afternoon, The Age is reporting that hackers responsible for successive cyber attacks on Lion Australia, the beverage giant, are threatening to auction or publish confidential company data on the dark web unless they are paid a reported ransom of $1 million. We didn't hear that from the Prime Minister today. So are you confident that what we're hearing from the PM is exactly what they know, or could this get out of control?
Well, I think the Lion hack looks to me like cyber criminals rather than state actors, and that's a big difference. I imagine there's a lot to be discovered by our government still about the extent of the Chinese hack. China is certainly interested in big data. It's interested in records of hundreds of thousands of people. It looks for that sort of material. It's useful to them in exactly that type of information is useful to Google or an Amazon in terms of being able to understand the behaviour of individuals. So they're certainly on the lookout for that type of information. But I think what the government was really talking about today in the Prime Minister's press conference is more about spying to understand political intent, the thinking of our leaders, our premiers. They're also looking for intellectual property that they can steal for their own use. And they're also very keen on the activities and behaviour of the Australians of Chinese background, the diaspora here in Australia, because the Chinese government likes to think that it can keep its thumb on the necks of those people. So there's a variety of different purposes that I think the hacking is engaged in. And above everything else, it's also simply about saying to the Australian government, look how big and bad we are. In other words, it's a political shot across the bows as much as it is an intelligence gathering effort.
Yes, and it's probably been reignited, and they have stepped up their hacking because of the fact that they're not in love with us at the moment, because we decided to initiate this inquiry into the origin of COVID-19. Can I ask you one last question? The PM refused to name China. And as you say, they've got form. If he'd have to know that it was China, why would he choose not to name them?
I think this is part of the signals of diplomacy, Chris. I think what he's doing is trying to say to the Chinese, look, we know, and if you guys don't ramp it back a little bit, we will actually come out with more information explaining what you do. And weirdly enough, Beijing is actually quite sensitive to that naming and shaming. So I think this is an attempt for Australia, for once, to put a bit of pressure on China rather than just the other way around. But yes, I agree with you. I think the Prime Minister would have a very high level of confidence as to where this is coming from. And, you know, that will be based on very careful analysis coming out of the Australian intelligence community.
Peter Jennings, thank you very much for your time this Friday night.